The unprecedented sanctions ever applied to any country in the history of mankind has been applied to Russia. But are the sanctions having the desired effects that the U.S. and the EU are looking for? Do sanctions actually ever yield the intended results, or do they have the opposite effect and become a self-inflicted economic wound? Hi, I'm Kaveh, and this is Economic Divide. Coming up in today's programs, we're going to take a look at the way that the U.S. has used sanctions. It's used sanctions out of any country. The economic damage that it inflicts is for its foreign policy goals, with a low success rate. We're going to examine why that is. Then, taking a look at the anti-Russia sanctions. The U.S. and the EU have imposed those sanctions on Russia. It has brought about economic destruction, in some sense, to Russia, but at the same time, it has harmed their own economies. Why are they pursuing that at the cost of the citizens of their own countries? And then finally, we want to take a look at a new global order, countries moving away from the reach of the dollar, standing up to the U.S. bullying. The United States has been described as an imperialist nation which has used a variety of military and non-military tools to maintain its hegemony. The military aspect of the U.S.'s imperialist power over the past several decades has cost countless of lives in the West Asian region and other parts of the world. The non-military weapons it has at its disposal have been at the service of marinating U.S. global hegemony. Economic sanctions are increasingly being used to promote the full range of American foreign policy objectives. Yet all too often, sanctions turn out to be little more than expressions of U.S. preferences that have hurt American economic interests without changing the target's behavior. There are a few countries in the world which have been put on the U.S. sanctions list. Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, China, and Russia are the countries which have faced tough U.S. sanctions. Richard Nephew, one of the architects of Washington's draconian sanctions on Iran, once said that the sanctions are designed to cause pain on Iranians so they can start pressuring the country's leadership to accept Washington's demands.
And so the U.S. has imposed sanctions on countries like Iran, like Venezuela, like Nicaragua, like Cuba, like Bolivia when it was under Evo Morales. And it uses sanctions as a way to basically hinder growth, to attack an enemy that is building an alternative form of society.
Russia, Iran, and other countries which are on the U.S. sanctions list have not been dissuaded from following their own policies. But the sanctions have jeopardized U.S.'s own interests. Imposing sanctions is a tactic the U.S. uses frequently to force countries it sees as foes to make concessions. The U.S., its economy, and its businesses are suffering from the aftermath of Washington's aggressive measures against other countries.
We have to know those are not sanctions approved by the United Nations Security Council, which would have no doubt about their legitimacy and wisdom. I mean, these are very, I should say, experimental sanctions. They are dealing with uncharted terrain. I mean, they are very wide and could create a lot of problems for global economy beyond the reasons why they were imposed.
When it comes to the issue of sanctions, pretty much the whole world is aware that the U.S. is the leading country by far to apply sanctions to countries around the world. Now, this issue cannot be taken lightly due to the damage that it causes those countries, just on a humanitarian level, for example. But what about the damage that the U.S. and its allies inflict on themselves? Well, here are some online posts on this matter. First post, the U.S. and its allies have implemented sanctions to pressure Putin to end the war in Ukraine. But with gas prices so high, is there a way to punish Putin without punishing ourselves?
I don't have to tell you that Americans are feeling the pain at the pump. Is there a way to punish Putin without punishing ourselves?
My short answer is no.
Then what on earth was the U.S. thinking when it imposed sanctions? It appears that the sanctions were not run past the Fed. Besides hurting the U.S. itself, the Western world, sanctions are hurting the entire world, which is trying to stand up and limp after a devastating COVID downturn. Next, U.S.-EU sanctions on Russia caused oil and gas to shoot up. Brent oil was $70 in November 2021 per barrel. Now it's $109 per barrel. By banning Russia, that produces 10% of the global oil, the EU wants the world to buy oil from OPEC. The poor are hurting from high food electricity and transport bills. Then, as one Twitter user has pointed out, even after all these expenditures, Russia's fiscal position will still be more solid than that of the U.S. So go figure that. Okay, that's what some of the viewers think out there. Let's see what Matthew Ehret thinks in this segment of our Q&A. He's our first guest. He's a senior fellow at the American University of Moscow, and he's the founder of Rising Tide Foundation, who joins us from Montreal. Matthew Ehret, welcome to Economic Divide. History has shown, based on what we have researched, that sanctions actually don't get the desired results. And of course, the U.S. is the one leading country in that respect. But it has also hurt itself more by imposing sanctions on others, while it has obviously created difficulties for the countries that it has sanctioned. Why does the U.S. then pursue what many have said is a failed strategy?
Well, I think that a big part of this has to do with a psychological dysfunction, which is really set into motion with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of this belief that the United States was the sole world hegemon and destined to rule the world after the Cold War had ended. And now we have 30 years into this process, a culture, a very poisonous, sick culture inside of Washington, D.C., and also many of the leading think tanks in Europe, especially around Great Britain, which have this inability to think in terms of reality. It's a lot of belief that one can manage the world simply by imposing the will of the strongest onto the weak. But these same encrusted technocrats who don't really have any real knowledge in the real world, they have no connection to real people, or the physical economy. Production is not part of their experience. They live in a world, like I said, of flatterers, of self-congratulating events like at Davos, at the World Economic Forum, where simply they get around patting each other on the back and inflaming each other's egos.
All right, well, let's bring in Shahzada Rahim. He's a writer and geopolitical analyst and also a personal assistant to the Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin, who joins us from Ankara, Turkey. Shahzada Rahim, welcome to Economic Divide. When you take a look at the way that sanctions are exercised by the U.S., records have shown that the U.S. Not only does not get the intended results that it wants, in many respects it actually hurts itself economically, because obviously there are not the type of revenues that it can generate from the countries that it sanctions. And then the countries find other ways to fulfill their economies in one way or another. But yet the U.S. has approached this time and again in order to obtain its foreign policy objectives. Why do you think that it keeps pursuing this strategy?
First of all, thank you for having me on the show. Let me tell you, the U.S. sanction strategy has a long history. We can trace this to the Cold War era. This particular strategy was pursued to overthrow the communist governments everywhere. We have seen a big episode of the regime change in the Latin America. It started from Chile. Chile was the best example of the recent era. It's the worst example. America was exposed when they overthrow the democratically elected president.
It is time now for our Info News section of the program, where we take a look at economic news from around the world. Our first piece of news is on what's called shrinkflation. I'm not too sure if you ever heard of it. In this case, it refers to British shoppers and something that they're experiencing. The reason for this term, rising commodity, energy, and labor costs, which has forced companies in the UK to actually downsize their products, hence shrinkflation. All right, moving on to our next topic. Here's one of the reasons this is happening, the stark and ugly reality that the Europeans have to face in terms of Russian gas. And that is coming from a Shell CEO who has issued a warning saying that Europe just can't replace Russian gas. And that's a Shell CEO who has stated that. He goes on to say that a shift to other suppliers is just not enough. And buying more pipeline gas and LNG actually is not going to solve the problem. Okay, next up, global hunger. We've talked about global hunger quite a bit in this program, but it's something that's important, especially in this day and age, and it's really sad to conclude that this is an avoidable tragedy. Why avoidable, and who is to blame? Well, rich nations. Next obvious question is how they can actually solve it. Well, they can save millions of lives if they fund what is called the UN Global Appeals. So if the solution is there, the question is, why aren't they acting on it? Moving on to our final story, this is quite incredible in a sense. Babies in the U.S. are crying a bit more than the rest of the world. Why? Because there's a massive baby formula shortage that has reached crisis levels. Panicked parents are actually having trouble finding baby formula at all. And this is partly due to the ongoing supply chain issues in that country. Those were the topics we picked for this week. If you have any topics that you would like for us to cover, especially in your part of the world, please make sure you send it to us. Contact information is on your screens now. Self-inflicted damage. That is the focus of our in-depth section. Welcome. Well, many around the world, especially countries in Europe, are realizing that the U.S. is leading them down a road of self-harm when it comes to the Russian sanctions. I mean, take the U.S. for example. Here is a chart of U.S. economic growth. If you take a look at the way it's been from the years 2016, it doesn't really matter in terms of the point I'm trying to make. Of course, you had that whopping negative 32.9% contraction in 2020, but this is the contraction as of late, negative 1.2% after the COVID, I guess, phase when it was over. Now, this is important because you're having that be a result of what has happened in terms of U.S. sanctions against Russia, along with its allies. And it's attributed to high energy prices. Let's bring in the New York Fed, who recently raised the interest rates to tame inflation in the U.S., but without any success as of yet.
Additionally, higher energy prices are driving up overall inflation. The surge in prices of crude oil and other commodities that resulted from Russia's invasion of Ukraine will put additional upward pressure on near-term inflation here at home.
Okay, so there you have the Fed talking about what the high oil prices are doing to the U.S. Of course, it says Russian invasion, but the U.S. keeps this war going with the way that it's assisting Ukraine militarily. Let's move on to the EU and see what's happening there with the respective countries. We chose some, and these are the types of inflation rates that these countries are experiencing. Lithuania, 15.6%, Estonia, 14.8%, Netherlands, 11.7%. Some of the big economies are at the bottom here. Spain, for example, 9.8%. Now, keep in mind, these inflation rates, these are the highest rates that these countries have experienced in decades. I mean, when you take a look at like the Netherlands, 11.7%, that's a lot for that country. And of course, Spain at 9.8%, again, high inflation rates for these countries that they haven't seen in decades, in quite some time. So that is examples of the countries, but when you then want to take the 27-member bloc and take a look at the average of what that amounts to, comes in at 7.8% for the entire European Union. 7.8%, that is the highest rate that the EU has experienced on record. Yet the EU insists that the Russian energy sanctions should go ahead. Okay, if that's what they want, let's take a look at what it's doing to its #1 economic powerhouse, namely Germany, Europe's biggest economy, facing a wave of bankruptcies. That has shocked the, economic world in a sense. This is what the Commerzbank chief executive officer has said. The aggressive sanctions are sending financial shockwaves through Germany, where almost a third of Germany's foreign trade has been impacted. Here's another country experiencing high inflation, the UK, 10.2%, a recession looming and energy prices to soon increase by another 40%. Many can't afford to cook, and pensioners are taking endless bus trips just to keep warm. That's what's happening in the UK. We need an emergency budget to boost people's purchasing power now before tragedy strikes. Who's saying that? Prem Sikka, member of the UK House of Lords. And that's how things are looking in the UK. Pretty bad, isn't it? The EU insists, however, that they need to apply pressure on Russia and continue with the sanctions. Let's take a look at the double standards, actually, that are at play when it comes to the European Union, in this case, the European Commission, who says it has no information that any European company has paid in rubles for Russian gas. No information. How could that be when, at the same time, this is what you're seeing happening? There are at least 10 European countries that are quietly buying gas with rubles. How can they be doing that? And for the European Commission not to have any information? Okay. Now, moving on, Russian gas deliveries via Ukraine. Guess what has happened? They have hit a 5-month high, rising to their highest since the end of November. So Russia is laughing all the way to the bank, making tons of money, or the money that they used to make in a sense, or as much, maybe close to it anyways. Now, in terms of the EU bloc itself, well, this is what they are leaning to do. It is leaning toward a ban on imports of Russian oil by the end of the year. They have said that that's what they want to do, so it's a phased approach. I wonder why they're picking the end of the year where you're looking at about 8 months down the road. Maybe they're hoping for the, I guess, the conflict to end sooner. Now, here's where the truth comes out from the German perspective, which may be the sentiment by the majority of European countries. Whether an overall oil embargo is about to happen, I don't know. And the person that's saying that is the economic minister of Germany. He says other countries are not there yet. This is German vice chancellor, I should say, an economic minister. And finally, he says Germany's position, for example, on gas is that we are not there yet. So this is what the Germany's economic minister is saying, and that is the stance pretty much of many European countries, if not almost all of them, because that's how much they rely on gas. Don't forget, in terms of the EU itself, 30 to 40% of its energy needs comes from Russia. Let me have our guests come back into the picture and give us some analysis. Matthew Ehret, senior fellow at the American University of Moscow, joins us. Matthew Ehret, welcome back. In the case of Russia, the U.S. and its allies have pursued a sanctions strategy, as I've mentioned and we've covered so far. But they don't really have a substantive game plan, do they? We're looking at the contraction in the U.S. at 1.25%. And, of course, the consequences, like in the UK, where you have cooking oil or cooking gas that's being sanctioned, or being rationed, I should say, shows how bad the situation has become. So, in a sense, hasn't this hurt the respective economies of the EU, for example, when it comes to the sanctions against Russia?
Most certainly that is the case. The actual population of Europe and of the United States are suffering greatly. They will continue to suffer as this goes forward. As you pointed out, gas prices are also increasing. Inflation is increasing. I think it's reached 7.4% in the first quarter. This is primarily hurting the people who are already suffering greatly because of 2 years of economic insanity under the pandemic and the lockdowns and the other things that have really destroyed businesses and destroyed so many lives over the past 2 years. So the people themselves, I mean, we're now seeing a 38-40% increase in gas prices at the pump. This is striking all across Europe. It's also striking the United States and Canada. This is absolutely devastating. And again, the leaders of the people, those represented to defend the interests of the nations and the people, have no grasp of this.
All right, let's bring back Shahzada Rahim, writer and geopolitical analyst, and see what he thinks. Shahzada Rahim, welcome back. The U.S. President Joe Biden and, of course, the European allies in particular, they have, obviously, the U.S. leading the pack in terms of pressuring them into this conflict. In a sense, has made this conflict become a global one, if you agree. I mean, the headline couldn't be any clearer. Biden's dangerous new Ukraine endgame, no endgame. So obviously, there are so many consequences globally as a result of this conflict that the U.S. is leading. But the U.S. has been at this for quite some time, hasn't it?
Like the West has been not serious. The West tried to cut off the economic ties with Russia. They throw out Russia from the SWIFT system, banking system. And the second thing they tried to, they imposed the huge sanctions, the largest sanctions ever in the human history, like imposed on any country after Iran, maybe. Iran is like suffering much more like since 2000 because of its nuclear program. But this was the worst case scenario in this case, because Russia is a big power. It's a big Eurasian power, because the Russian economy is more and more important. It's not just important for European economies, but it's also important for the world economy.